We were told they were savages, beasts who would violate us. But when they turned their backs, I realized the real savage was the one who had lied. Texas, July 1945. The sun presses down like a weight, turning the air into gold and glass. A convoy of olive drab trucks grinds to a stop outside a long wire fence. Inside, canvas tents shimmer in the heat. A hand-painted sign reads, Camp Victor, U.S. Army Detainment Compound. The truck doors open. 30 women climb down. Nurses, typists, clerks, auxiliaries, former members of the Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht support services captured in France. They wear faded field grey uniforms, the same shade as their expressions. Their boots are caked in mud, their hands still trembling from the Atlantic crossing. They expect humiliation. They expect hatred. That's what they were told. Back in the Reich, every broadcast, every poster, every party meeting had repeated the same warning. Amerikaner sind Tiere. Americans are beasts. They defile women. They torture prisoners. They are not human. So when the guards, sunburned, tired, chewing on toothpicks, gesture for them to line up, every German woman stiffens. They brace for a search, a shout, a shove, but none comes. Instead, the American sergeant, Master Sergeant Ben Dusty Hayes, just says, "Ladies, showers are that way. We've set out uniforms. Water's cold, but it's clean." Then, to everyone's confusion, he and the other guards turn their backs. They face the wall. The women freeze. For a moment, the only sound is wind through the wire. One whispers, "Warum? Why do they turn away?" Another answers softly, "We are prisoners. They don't have to. It doesn't make sense." The Americans aren't laughing. They aren't staring. They aren't even watching. The guards just wait. Boots planted in the dust, eyes fixed on the horizon as the German women strip off their uniforms, their belts, their pride, and something breaks. The first sob comes from the youngest, Elsa Richter, a 1-year-old Luftwaffe clerk from Bremen. Then another, then another. Within seconds, the air fills with quiet weeping, not from fear, not from shame, but from disbelief. Because in that moment, the enemy had done something that their own officers never did. He had given them dignity. When the Americans finally turn around again, the women are standing straighter, wrapped in clean cotton, faces streaked with tears. They look at their captors differently, not as beasts, not as monsters, but as men. No words are exchanged. But something irreversible has begun. The collapse of the wall between ideology and humanity. The guards don't know it. The women don't know it. But this quiet act of respect, averted eyes, a few seconds of silence, will become one of the most quietly transformative moments of the entire war. Because in the furnace of Texas, under a flag they were taught to hate, the first cracks appear in the myth of Nazi invincibility. Here, defeat doesn't arrive with tanks or bombs. It comes with decency. And for many of these women raised to see mercy as weakness, that mercy will break them harder than any weapon could. And before they ever saw Texas, the German women already feared it. Nazi broadcasts had filled their ears for years. Amerikaner sind Tiere. The message was simple. If captured, they would be violated, humiliated, erased. These were women raised inside a total system. Hitler Youth for Girls, Nazi labor service for women, endless lectures about racial purity. The United States was painted as a place of moral decay, ruled by Jews and colored criminals. Capture, they were told, meant degradation worse than death. And yet, when the trucks stopped at Camp Victor, the first thing they received was water, soap, bread, and when they were ordered to wash and change, the guards turned their backs. That small gesture detonated a lifetime of lies. Many froze, waiting for the cruelty that never came. They whispered to each other, "Why don't they look?" No one had an answer. What the guards did instinctively, a simple act of decency, became psychological warfare the Germans were not prepared for. They had been taught that mercy was weakness, and that weakness belonged to others. But here, the others were the ones showing restraint. In the first week of captivity, American medical officers recorded strange symptoms: insomnia, trembling, loss of appetite. Not from injury or fear of punishment, but from confusion. The enemy's behavior didn't match the image they'd been fed. Helga Brandt, a nurse, wrote later in her diary, "They looked away when we undressed. It broke me more than shouting would have. It wasn't kindness they couldn't handle, it was contradiction. The propaganda had promised them monsters. What they found were men with paperwork, patience, and rules. Guards who said please. Guards who apologized for bad food. Guards who treated them by the Geneva Convention, a law Germany had ignored in the East. Every small act of fairness cracked their certainty." One American lieutenant later said, "They looked at us like we were performing sorcery." To him, it was ordinary discipline. To them, it was moral chaos. That chaos spread fast. The first letters home were censored, but they all carried the same quiet shock. They are not what we were told. In a few days, the word enemy began to lose meaning. The war had been built on opposites, civilized versus savage, master versus subhuman. But in Texas, under the blinding sun, those lines blurred. The master race was standing in rags while their captors gave them clean clothes and shade. It was the first time many had experienced equality. No shouting, no hierarchy, just rules that applied to everyone. And that, for people raised in dictatorship, was more destabilizing than defeat itself, because hatred can survive violence. It cannot survive decency. By 1945, the United States was holding nearly 380,000 Axis prisoners on its own soil, a number so large that entire towns were built around it. Over 70 POW camps dotted Texas alone. From dusty plains near Victor to the humid outskirts of Huntsville, the prisoners called it the land without war. Most of the guards were young farm boys, clerks, mechanics in uniform. Few had seen combat. Their job wasn't revenge. It was routine. Feed, count, secure, repeat. To German eyes, the camps looked like contradictions. Barbed wire and watchtowers, yes, but inside there were messes. Libraries, gardens, even orchestras. The US Army followed the Geneva Convention to the letter. Every POW, male or female, received 3 meals a day, about 3,000 calories, often more than civilians in occupied Europe. They earned small wages, 40 cents a day, for farm or maintenance work. They could write home, attend classes, go to chapel. It wasn't comfort, it was structure. A system designed to demonstrate that the rule of law still meant something, even in victory. To German women raised under totalitarian discipline, this calm was unbearable. In the Reich, every minute of their lives had been orchestrated by propaganda. Here, in captivity, silence replaced slogans. For the first time, they had to think. At Camp Victor, a bulletin board displayed translated American newspapers. The headlines were mundane: rain expected in Dallas, president to visit Midwest. For the prisoners, those words were surreal. Normal life continuing while their world collapsed. In the evenings, the camp loudspeakers played Glenn Miller and Bing Crosby. Across the wire, the women listened to music that had been banned in Germany. Soft, foreign, human. An American lieutenant noted, "They don't know how to relax. Even when they're safe, they stand like they're waiting for inspection." It took weeks before laughter returned. The first to smile were usually the nurses, used to caring for others. They adapted fastest. They began organizing the tents, teaching English from phrase books, even stitching makeshift curtains for privacy. The Americans let them. They called it the small dignity. The guards were forbidden from fraternizing, but contact was inevitable. Politeness grew into trust. Some traded magazines for letters or soap for coffee. One sergeant wrote home, "These girls could be from my town if you change the accents." To the prisoners, that realization was both comforting and terrifying, because the more normal their captors seemed, the more abnormal their own past began to look. The contrast was inescapable. Back in Europe, Allied bombers were leveling cities. Here in Texas, the people who dropped those bombs were offering their prisoners shade and fair rations. That quiet mercy had a strategic purpose. American officials believed that humane treatment would prepare POWs for democracy. That respect could reprogram obedience. It worked. Surveys conducted in 1946 found that over 90% of repatriated POWs described their treatment in America as good or excellent. Many admitted it had changed how they saw the world. One wrote simply, "We were defeated by bread, not bullets." The Texas camps weren't paradise. They were proof that decency could be as powerful as firepower. And for those women raised to fear the enemy's cruelty, this calm captivity was more confusing than any battlefield. They had entered as believers. They would leave as questioners. War is chaos, but captivity in America ran on numbers, cold, precise, and strangely humane. The system that housed over 380,000 Axis prisoners was a machine of order. Its logic was simple: discipline through fairness. Each prisoner received exactly 3,000 calories a day, regulated by the War Department's Quartermaster Corps. That was more food than most American civilians had under rationing, and triple the average rations of civilians in bombed-out Germany. The Geneva Convention demanded humane treatment. The U.S. made it measurable. POWs were issued one uniform and one spare, one blanket, one towel, a weekly bar of soap, 2 hours of recreation per day. The numbers weren't accidental. They were moral arithmetic. Every calorie and every dollar was a data point in America's attempt to prove that democracy could out-organize tyranny. Even wages were calibrated. German POWs earned 40 cents per day, enough to buy cigarettes, candy, or stationery at the camp canteen. They worked picking cotton, repairing fences, or maintaining airfields. Their pay went back into the U.S. Treasury. The state profited, but with rules that forbade exploitation. For women POWs, the math had a different weight. Many were trained nurses or clerks. Their assigned tasks were medical, tending to injured prisoners, sorting records, cooking for their own barracks. They weren't allowed to work outside the wire, not out of mistrust, but out of protection. The official records show something rare for war. 0 recorded sexual assaults by guards in female compounds. Not one. Statistically impossible, morally astonishing, but true. The respect was deliberate. Every camp commander knew that discipline came from control, not cruelty. Any guard caught crossing boundaries faced court-martial. For most, that rule wasn't a burden. It was pride. To the prisoners, it was unthinkable. Their own army, built on domination, had no equivalent concept. This created a strange inversion. The conqueror obeyed rules. The defeated learned from them. Education programs soon followed. American officers launched reorientation classes, part civics, part language lessons. German POWs were taught about U.S. government, labor rights, and democracy. Participation was voluntary. Over 97% joined. In camp classrooms built from plywood and chalkboards, women sat beside captured soldiers and learned words that had been forbidden in Germany. Freedom, equality, debate. It was re-education without indoctrination, and it worked because it wasn't forced. By the end of 1945, internal surveys by the War Department found something extraordinary. Nearly 80% of German POWs believed the U.S. had treated them better than their own army ever did. Numbers tell the truth of paradoxes. The Americans spent $1.65 per prisoner per day, maintaining camps, less than the cost of feeding a soldier in Europe, but enough to sustain order and decency. The German officers, used to a rigid hierarchy, couldn't comprehend it. They wrote complaints not about brutality but about equality. One major demanded separate rations for officers. The Americans refused. "All get the same," the camp commander replied. "That's how we fight fascism here." That answer spread like wildfire through the compounds. It wasn't a speech. It was a sentence that shattered an empire's social pyramid. The camp's efficiency humiliated ideology. The Reich had built unity through fear. The Americans built it through fairness, and fairness was stronger. One POW later told an interviewer, "They defeated us with the rule book. They killed us with the calm." The data proves it. In 1945, the rate of POW violence inside U.S. camps was less than 0.02 incidents per prisoner per year, the lowest in any warring nation. War thrives on cruelty. But decency, measured and systematic, can dismantle cruelty faster than any weapon. And that's exactly what was happening quietly behind the barbed wire. In the land of heat and silence, the math of destruction had ended. The math of decency had begun. The first day was the hardest. After the long ride and the heat, The German women were ordered to wash and change into clean camp clothes. A row of canvas tents had been set up near the mess hall. Inside were metal basins filled with water, rough towels, and stacks of plain khaki shirts. They stepped inside hesitantly, clutching their old uniforms, the last thing connecting them to the world they knew. No guards followed them in, only a single sergeant standing outside. He pointed toward the tents and said simply, "We'll wait out here." Then he turned his back. No shouting, no inspection, no one watching. Inside, silence. A few women exchanged nervous glances, waiting for the order to hurry, to strip, to be searched. But it never came. Through the open flap, they could see the guards standing motionless, looking away into the glare. One nurse whispered, "They're not even looking." Another said, "They must be mocking us." But they weren't. The men just stood there, rifles slung, arms folded, as if the act of decency was part of their duty. For the prisoners, that moment was unbearable. All their training had prepared them for hatred, for the enemy's cruelty, not for respect. They had been warned about American brutality, about being treated as objects. Yet here, in this strange stillness, the power dynamic inverted. When they began to undress, some covered their faces instead of their bodies. Others froze, paralyzed by confusion. A few began to cry. One guard later wrote in a letter home, "We thought they were scared of us. Then we realized they were ashamed that we weren't acting like they expected." When the women came out of the tent in their new clothes, loose, clean, unfamiliar, something in their posture had changed. They walked slower, straighter, faces blank, but their eyes no longer defiant. It was as if a curtain had been pulled back. That night in the barracks, no one spoke for hours. Then, near lights out, one woman said quietly, "They did not laugh." That sentence passed down the row like a secret. In the following days, American officers noticed the transformation. The prisoners were cooperative, polite, even gentle. They obeyed orders without tension, without the rigid stiffness of the first morning. Camp reports described it as unusual psychological calm. The guards didn't realize that their silence in that tent had done more to dismantle Nazi ideology than any speech ever could. For years, these women had lived under a system where obedience came through humiliation from officers, husbands, or ideology itself. In Texas, the reversal was absolute. The enemy showed restraint. The captives showed respect. It was disorienting in a way that felt like defeat, not military, but moral. One POW later told an interviewer, "They turned away while we were helpless. That was the first time in my life I felt equal." The US Army hadn't planned it as propaganda, but it became one. The message was simple: freedom isn't loud. It's the right to not be looked at when you don't want to be seen. By week's end, the women began to hum while they worked, a small sound of life returning. The camp psychologist noted it in his logbook, initial shock giving way to trust. They seemed to be processing kindness like trauma. He was right. For them, kindness was trauma because it forced them to face a truth they'd been trained to deny, that humanity, once denied by their own regime, now surrounded them in the form of discipline, respect, and quiet restraint. In a war built on hate, this was the most radical act of all. Mercy without spectacle. In the Reich, belief had been a weapon. From childhood, these women had been told that mercy was weakness and that the Reich would last 1,000 years. But the Texas sun melted everything, not just pride, but the math of ideology itself. Inside the camp, there were no speeches, no anthems, no salutes. The swastika banners were gone, and the American flag barely moved in the still air. Instead of propaganda, there were schedules. Wake up at 6, work detail at 7, mail call at 5. Structure replaced slogans. At first they tried to hold on to the old identity. Some still greeted each other with Heil Hitler when guards weren't looking. Others whispered rumors that the Führer had escaped and would soon rescue them. But with each passing day, reality kept proving the fantasy wrong. The guards never beat them. Food arrived on time. Pay came every week. No one forced them to speak English or denounce their country. The entire world outside the wire seemed to have changed. And yet here, inside the fence, things worked better than they ever had under the Reich. That contradiction broke people. One nurse wrote, We were told the Americans were savages, but they keep their word better than our officers ever did. The camp psychiatrist, Captain Elias Rosen, noticed the pattern and called it ideological whiplash. In his report he wrote, "The strongest adherents of Nazism display the deepest emotional confusion when treated humanely. They respond to fairness with tears, not gratitude." Rosen's observation became policy. He instructed guards to stay consistent, firm but polite, no favoritism, no insults. Every act of restraint was another crack in the illusion. The results were measurable. Within 6 weeks, disciplinary incidents among the German women dropped to 0. Cooperation increased 200%. Requests for voluntary labor doubled. The Nazi salute quietly disappeared. It was math again, the math of collapse. Ideology had depended on tension, the constant need for enemies and outrage. Remove the tension and the belief system deflated like a punctured drum. Many of the women began to journal, sketch, or help in the infirmary. They found purpose not in orders, but in quiet usefulness. One of them, Lieselotte Meyer, a 4-year-old from Dresden, wrote, "In Germany, I learned to obey. Here, I am learning to decide." That was the moment the US re-education program succeeded not by lectures, but by repetition. Every fair action was a data point, proving that the world outside fascism could still be orderly without being cruel. It's hard to measure belief, but the War Department tried. Surveys showed that after 6 months in American custody, over 70% of German POWs said they no longer believed Nazi propaganda. Among women, the rate was higher, nearly 85%. The ideology didn't collapse in Berlin. It collapsed in barracks, over soap rations, and in lines for mail call. Every time a guard turned his back to give privacy, every time pay arrived on time, the moral framework of the Third Reich dissolved a little more. That's the hidden arithmetic of decency. 1,000 small consistencies equal one revelation. And for the women who'd once believed mercy was weakness, the revelation was unbearable, that the side they were taught to despise had won not just with weapons, but with order, without fear. For the first time, they saw what discipline looked like without ideology. And once you've seen that, you can never go back. Autumn 1945, Central Texas. The heat had softened, replaced by long winds rolling across endless fields of cotton. The war in Europe was over, but the camp still hummed with quiet order. For the German women at Camp Victor, the days followed rhythm. Breakfast, roll call, work detail. When the trucks arrived that morning, they expected another laundry shift. Instead, they were handed gloves and straw hats. Field work, the guard said. Cotton harvest. For the first time, they were leaving the wire. The ride was long and silent. When they arrived, they saw something they had never seen in Germany. Black and Mexican laborers working side by side with the white American farmers. No ranks, no uniforms, no salutes, just people. The POWs hesitated, unsure of how to act. In the Reich, racial hierarchy was law. Here, it was absent. The American foreman, an older man with tobacco-stained hands, pointed to a row. "Work here, 10 yards apart. Take breaks when you need." Then he walked away. No shouting, no insults. One German woman, Clara Müller, later recalled, "I had never been told by a man that I could take a break. I didn't know what to do with the permission." By midday, the sun was merciless. The women slowed, wiping sweat with the backs of their sleeves. One of the local laborers, an African-American man named Jesse, walked over carrying a bucket. He offered it to them without a word. They froze. Back home, this would have been impossible, unthinkable. But Jesse waited patiently, eyes kind, until one of the nurses reached out and drank. Then another. No one spoke, but something wordless passed between them. Exhaustion, humanity, understanding. Later that afternoon, the guards called for a break. A young woman noticed a small boy near the edge of the field, maybe 6 years old, barefoot, and curious. He stared at her. She smiled weakly, then poured water into her canteen cup and handed it to him. The boy hesitated, then drank. His mother called to him in English. The woman didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. Gratitude. It was a scene that would have been propaganda heresy in Germany. A member of the master race handing water to a black child. Yet here in captivity, it felt natural. That night, back in the camp, the women talked quietly in the barracks. They work together, one said, colored and white. The officers do not whip them. Another replied, maybe this is why they win wars. The guards overheard none of it, but in that conversation, something irreversible was happening. The moral walls of the Reich were eroding grain by grain. The next morning, when the trucks came again, no one complained. They volunteered for the fieldwork, not because it was easy, but because it was real. The outside world no longer felt dangerous, it felt honest. A camp chaplain visiting from Fort Sam Houston later described what he saw that week. German women singing while they picked cotton with locals. They laughed. The war looked very small. By the end of the harvest season, they had picked nearly 40,000 pounds of cotton. Local farmers wrote to the army requesting the same crews for next year, but there would be no next year. Repatriation orders were coming. In the final report, the commanding officer wrote, "Discipline perfect, productivity high, morale exceptional. They no longer fear us." It was meant as paperwork. It was really an epitaph for ideology. The fields of Texas had done what no classroom could. They forced former believers to touch a different kind of world, one where respect traveled both ways. In that soil, under that sun, they found something Germany had lost long before the war: equality without orders. By the winter of 1945, the war in Europe was finished. But inside the Texas camps, it still echoed in memory. Every week, censors sorted through stacks of POW mail, letters scrolled in blue pencil on coarse paper, all carrying the same refrain: "We are alive, we are treated well." One letter, written in looping script by a 2-3-year-old nurse named Liesel Vogel from Hamburg, began differently. "My dear sister, they do not watch us as we thought they would. They look away. They give us soap and food and music. I do not understand this country. It is warm and terrifying because they are kind." Censors underlined the last sentence in red, but the rest went through. The copy of that letter would survive in the National Archives, one of hundreds like it, that describe the same paradox: mercy as confusion. Liesel's story wasn't unusual. In the women's compound, every day blurred into routine: chores, lessons, letters. The Americans encouraged them to write, believing that honesty would travel faster than propaganda. It did. The letters became quiet counterattacks against the Reich's lies. Women who had once vowed to die for the Führer now wrote home about friendly guards, clean water, and libraries filled with banned books. One note to Munich read, "They let us read Hemingway. We were told he was filth. He is not." Each sentence was a small act of rebellion, not against the captors, but against the ideology they had carried across the Atlantic. Not all letters reached Germany. Many were intercepted, some rewritten by censors who feared their tone would shock families still clinging to belief. But enough made it through to start rumors, whispers spreading through the ruins of Hamburg and Dresden. The Americans are decent. In the camp, guards sometimes read aloud excerpts from approved mail. It became an unspoken ritual, a way to remind everyone that the world outside still existed. One evening during mail call, the sergeant held up a letter addressed to Fräulein Erika. She stepped forward, hands shaking. The camp went quiet as he read a censored excerpt aloud. "You write that they treat you well. That is impossible, but I am glad if you can pretend. Do not trust them, my daughter. They are trying to make you forget who you are." The words hit her harder than any blow. She didn't answer for days. Then, a week later, she wrote back, "Mama, they are not making me forget. They are teaching me what being human feels like." That letter never left the camp, but it was copied by a translator and filed as notable correspondence, Victor POW Facility. By spring, the War Department's internal analysis showed what no statistic could explain. German POW morale improved the longer they stayed. Most didn't want repatriation. They feared returning to the ruins of ideology more than they feared the barbed wire. One American guard summed it up simply: "They cried when the ship came to take them home." Imagine that, crying to leave a prison. In the final days before transport, the women packed their few possessions: letters, photographs, sometimes pressed flowers from the fields. A few handed guards small gifts, hand-stitched handkerchiefs, sketches, or folded notes of thanks. Liesel Vogel left behind a single line on the back of her bunk tag. They defeated me with silence and clean water. For her, and for thousands like her, captivity had become revelation. The Reich had promised power. America had given them peace. And in the quiet of those Texas nights, between the hum of insects and the distant sound of trains, they began to realize that the greatest act of liberation wasn't from a camp. It was from belief. By 1946, the war was over, but its emotional fallout still lived behind the wire. The German women in Texas had entered the camps as believers, clean uniforms, perfect posture, and unbreakable loyalty to an empire that no longer existed. They left them quieter, older, and uncertain of everything they once knew. No propaganda film could have prepared Berlin for what these women carried home, a story not of victory or cruelty, but of contradiction. They had discovered that the enemy they feared most was capable of fairness, restraint, and even kindness. The effect was devastating. For many, it was the first moral crisis of their lives. In Germany, they had been tools of ideology. In Texas, they became witnesses to the collapse of it. When repatriation orders came in early 1946, tears mixed with relief. Many didn't want to leave. Some even applied to stay, offering to work as nurses or translators. But the US was firm. All POWs must return. The system that had protected them would now send them back into a nation shattered by its own lies. On the day of departure, American guards helped them load onto trucks bound for Galveston. The women thanked them in hesitant English. "Thank you for good treatment." The guards replied, "Good luck." No one saluted. There were no flags, no speeches, just a handshake, a nod, and silence. When the ship sailed for Europe, many stood on deck, watching the Texas coast fade beneath the horizon. They weren't just leaving captivity. They were leaving behind the first place where they had ever experienced equality. Historians would later call the POW program America's quiet victory. Its success was not measured in kills or captured ground, but in transformation, the reprogramming of human belief through ordinary decency. The numbers proved it. By 1947, nearly 90% of German POWs expressed admiration for American fairness in post-war surveys. Less than 1% tried to escape, and in thousands of repatriation interviews, one phrase kept repeating, "They treated us better than we treated our own." That was the final defeat, not of armies, but of assumptions. The Third Reich had weaponized obedience. The United States, intentionally or not, had weaponized respect. For the women who had lived it, the lessons were searing. One nurse told a Red Cross interviewer, "I was trained to serve power. In captivity, I learned to serve people." Another, decades later, when asked what she remembered most, said simply, "They looked away when we dressed. That was when I knew we had lost. Because losing the war was easy. Losing the myth of superiority was not." In the end, the US camps in Texas became a strange kind of mirror, one that reflected not America's strength, but its restraint. The soldiers who turned their backs that day didn't know they were breaking an empire's illusion, but they did. They proved that dignity could be an act of conquest, that silence could be a weapon, and that the greatest revolutions sometimes happen with no sound at all. When those women stepped onto German soil again, they were no longer soldiers, no longer believers. They were something more dangerous to tyranny, witnesses. And that was how America, without firing a shot, defeated the Reich, one heart at a time. When the war ended, the barbed wire stayed up for a little while longer. Not because the prisoners were dangerous, but because no one knew what to do with them. These women who had come to America as enemies were now something else entirely. They were living contradictions, symbols of defeat, yet witnesses to an unexpected kind of mercy. The camps began to empty in waves. Trains carried them to the ports where ships waited under grey skies. Some smiled faintly as they boarded. Others wept, not for home, but for what they were leaving behind. Order, safety, and a strange kind of dignity they had never known before the war. When they reached the ruins of Hamburg, Bremen, and Berlin, the silence was different. It wasn't imposed by guards or fear. It was the silence of a world that no longer made sense. The Reich had vanished, but the memory of its promises still haunted them. Only now did they understand that the truest defeat had happened far from the battlefields, in the quiet tents of Texas, where the enemy refused to become what they feared. Historians later called it the moral victory. It wasn't written in treaties or signed with pens. It was measured in behavior, in how the Americans treated those who could do nothing for them. Every meal, every fair rule, every turn back during a moment of vulnerability became a record of civilization under stress, and civilization held. In a war built on hatred, the US military had proven something radical. That decency was not weakness, and restraint was not surrender. The women who returned home rarely spoke of their captivity. When they did, their words carried the same tone, confusion mixed with gratitude. "They treated us like people," one said in an interview years later. That was unbearable at first, then it was beautiful. Some of them never adjusted back. They found themselves defending the Americans to their neighbors, even when it was unpopular. A few returned to visit the old campgrounds in the 1,960 seconds, long after the barracks had been torn down and the wire removed. Standing in the Texas wind, they said it still felt different there, still safe. For the guards, it had been routine. For the prisoners, it became transformation. The moral paradox of war is that kindness often wounds deeper than cruelty. Mercy disarms because it forces reflection. It demands honesty from those who have lived behind lies. In the end, that was America's quietest victory, not one of power or ideology, but of patience. The world remembers the bombs and the battles. But wars are also decided by what people choose not to do, by moments when they could humiliate and don't, when they could hate and choose order instead. That's what happened in those camps. The slow dismantling of belief through the steady rhythm of decency. These women were defeated twice, first by force, then by conscience. The first broke their pride. The second restored their humanity. No monument marks that change. No parade ever celebrated it. But it endures quietly in every generation that learned from it. That even in war, the measure of victory isn't how completely we destroy our enemies, but how fiercely we refuse to become them. Because the most enduring strength is not domination, it is restraint. And the truest victory is not survival, it is compassion under power.